Welcome to Module 3. We're going to really start diving into the design process, specifically looking at activities we can do and other things that we can do. What are the best practices out there? The goal is to engage that audience and to bring them in to help them feel comfortable. It's funny, when I used to teach marriage retreats, one of the first things I would show is this clip. It was a Budweiser commercial. It was all about football. And it was essentially the ref making a bad call, and here was everyone yelling at the ref, and the coach was just sitting there yelling at the ref. And the announcer said, well, where would you learn to take a beating like that? And it immediately cut to him at home and his wife just yelling in his ear and him just kind of ignoring it and saying at that point, yeah, like, that's where I learned how to do this, not pay attention or not be overly affected. Now, obviously, that's not the right strategy to have at home, but showing that football clip suddenly made the men feel like, hey, this is not the blame fest I thought it was going to be. And oh, I really like that guy Nate. He represents me up there. You know, Nate, you're our man up there. You tell him how it is. And this is something we experience, sort of thing. It created a whole lot of comfortability, and it allowed them to relax and start to learn. And yeah, maybe it was a little bit of hyperbole, or maybe it was over the top, but it was about helping them to be comfortable, because we knew that the wives were dragging the husbands to be here, and we wanted to make sure that they felt welcome and they were good. All right, so let's dive in and let's talk about what it takes to teach in an effective way. We've kind of highlighted some of these topics before, and we'll keep highlighting them. And so you're going to get a dose and a dose and a dose. So if you hear me say something I've said before or that I'll say again, too bad. You need to be able to absorb it, and it may take multiple times to do that. This is one of the most surprising statistics that's out there. 50% of the effectiveness of any program is based on simply who the instructor is, how they do it well. Think about the classes that have been the best that you've had. Probably a professor that you've resonated with or connected to. The better the educator, the more they're going to take out of the class. And let's be honest, there's a skill that goes along with educating. And so if you have the skill, you can be a good educator. If you don't have the skill, you're going to have to learn how to develop that skill. And it takes some practice to be better and better. If you have great information, but a terrible presenter, they're not going to learn very much. So you got to have a great presenter and great information working together to create a really good presentation. So the educator has to create a relationship of trust. The people have to feel like, hey, it is safe to be here. They also have to make the connection that, hey, that person up there teaching me is a real person. They're similar, very similar to me. They go through some of the same challenges. They have some of the same struggles that I do. And they have to understand my situation. They not only have to know what it's like to be human, but they have to know what it's like to be me as a human. And so I'm looking for those things. How do you communicate that to people? It's one of the great secrets of being a good communicator. One of the best ways to do that, and it's something that's debated, is through the process of self-disclosure. Self-disclosure means that I share something personal about me, and it helps to create a connection with the audience. For example, I could maybe share the story of how my wife and I met, that we were playing softball against one another, that she went to tag my friend and got him out, but actually hit him as she went to tag. She hit him in between his legs, put him on the ground, and kind of walked up to him and said, "You're out, go sit down." And I remember thinking in that moment, I need to meet this girl. Just sharing an experience like that, a true story, helps you to recognize, hey, I remember how I met my wife or my spouse, and here was my experience. This is what it was like. So it's very important to maybe share those things, not your greatest secret, but to connect in a way that allows people to do that. Remember, we mentioned last time, we're going to begin the design process with the end in mind, and we're going to develop those learner outcomes. We're always going to be grading those learner outcomes. Are they in the right format? What is the person able to do? Upon successful completion of this program, a person will be able to, and I put a colon there, and then I start off with the verb. Discuss effective communication strategies, implement a timeout, create a plan, whatever it is, I have to have a verb that I can observe. So let's recognize and see how this works together. See, the goals that we have up top, they help us to design the activities that are down here on the side. And the activities that we have leads to the assessment that we have. And the assessment tells us whether or not we've accomplished the goals. And those are connected. So effective instruction is always going to start with good learning outcomes, learning objectives, and then a design that helps to do that and a way to assess that. We're not going to give people quizzes in our classes, but we are going to have them demonstrate their knowledge. And that's a form of assessment. Can they practice the skill as I go around? Do I hear people doing that? We can coach them. We can watch it happen. That's going to be how we know. Here's the great thing about family life education. One thing that I've learned is something I call the elevator principle. Think about being stuck in the elevator with other people, with strangers. Even if you're the biggest introvert in the world, you're probably going to talk to the other person you're stuck with. If you think about a plane flight that you were on and being delayed, and you're sitting next to some person and you just hear the announcement of, oh, it's going to be another 2 hours. You kind of look at that person and you're like, can you believe this? I can't believe this. I saw that book that you had. What do you do? Like, instantly we're somehow connected. Why? Because we're stuck in an elevator, stuck at the airport. We're in the same situation. We have something in common. You get me, and therefore what I have to say, you get. If we're going to be here for a while, we might as well fill the time. And so the elevator principle is something that helps people to feel more comfortable in family life education settings, just knowing that we're going to be here for a while. Recognize that it takes time for people to feel truly comfortable. Somewhere around 4 to 6 hours to be doing that. Once those norms are set, people can open up and we can really start to get going. But it has to be helped with appropriate self-disclosure. Sometimes people are like, I don't want to share my stories. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'2", 6'3". We won't mention how hefty I am, but I'm a big guy. I'm not afraid of sharing information with other people. But if I were a female who was 5'2", I may not want to tell people something that told them where I lived, or that I go jogging every Tuesday at a place. I may not feel safe doing that. And if you don't feel safe, then find something that is safe to share. You may also use other people's stories, as long as you recognize that the world is incredibly small and that you only want to share information that's not personally identifiable. I wouldn't say I have a good friend who opened this restaurant and he was going through a hard time, and someone raises their hand and say, oh yeah, that's my cousin. And you're talking about their marriage and great. Oh, whoops. You want to make sure that it's something that you can use and it's appropriate using. And you don't want to put people out, and you don't want to put them in a negative experience. And so you can tell stories, whether they're personal or retold. Those stories have a profound impact on people because it connects this abstract material to reality. Here's an example of where I could use this, and here's how I would do it. It helps them to be able to put information together. I say that you always need at least 2 examples. That means you need to give them an example of how to do it, and then maybe a role play that shows it, or a story that kind of ties it together. With 2 or 3 pieces of information, they can say, okay, that's how it works there. This is how it works there. This is how it's going to work in my life, right? If you only give them one, they'll know, hey, if I'm ever in that situation, here's what I'm going to do. But if I have more of those connections, then I know I'm going to be ready for those things and be able to talk about them as they come. Okay. So I had a great professor whose name was Terry Olson, and he had this exercise that he did with a friend of his. He and his friend had grown up together, and they became best friends over time, and they both became college professors. And they learned, and they had posited that you can use a good story to teach about anything. And so they tried what was called the two fishbowl activity. And they would get up to teach something, and they would pick a story out of the fishbowl that they had in common. Remember that time we were down at the fishing hole and someone did this and they said this and that, and everyone laughed and the story was funny. And he said, and that relates to this family topic. And he reached in and pulled out a topic, not knowing what the topic was. As soon as he read it, he said, this is how it connects. And he was able to connect it in some form or fashion. Even if a story doesn't sound exciting, it can be demonstrative. It can be demonstrate what could be done or how it could be different. We're also going to operate on this principle of tell them what you're going to teach them, then teach them what you told them you're going to teach them, and then tell them what you taught them. So there's a introduction, there is the delivery of content, and there is a summary. And there's a variety of ways to do that summary in a way that's going to be effective. Remember that we want to get things into a take-home message, something that you could put in your mental briefcase, something that's nice and small. What's the phrase that sticks with people? Think of something like families that play together stay together. Most of you already knew that. Why? Because that's a catchphrase. It's a take-home message that you can remember. Parents do better or kids do better when parents stick together. That's a take-home message that they can do. It also proves that they've actually learned something. One example that I love is to use what's called one thing. One thing is what I use at the end to do a summary of everything I've talked about. And I'll simply say, you guys have sat here today for 2 hours. What's one thing that you've learned that really kind of hits you? And one person shares, and I'm like, great, that's a great summary of this. And another person shares, and here's another piece, and this resonated with me, and there's a third piece. If I sit there for about 4 or 5 people, everything that I've talked about has been recapped. And people have, well, I could do what he's doing. I could do what she said she's going to do. I'm going to go implement those in my life. I like to start off the next class with one thing. What's one thing you did differently? What's one thing that you applied? How did it work? Because then it shows them again of this is how it can be implemented and here's what might come out of it. One of the most important things that you have to learn at Family Life Education is the delicate balance between education and support. As an educator, I want to give them as much information as I can. As a person coming to a lesson, I might need support the most. And so I want to, what do I need to do in my situation and help me and talk to me about this? Well, no, I want to teach you. Well, you have to balance those two. Sometimes education's more important than supporting. Sometimes support is way more important than education. Recognize that as you're doing this balance and you're self-disclosing and doing all of that, don't make it about you. More of them and less of you is better. Sometimes someone who needs a lot of support will just dominate a whole lesson. And sometimes you're going to have to stop and say, you know what, Bob, it sounds like you need a lot of help right now and you're stuck trying to figure out what to do. I have an idea. We're going to get into a circle. Bob, you and I are in the middle. And we're going to go around and get the best piece of advice from every person in the circle about your situation and what you can do. And so then I take 10 minutes and I write it down for Bob. And I'm like, oh yeah. And Bob looks at each person around the circle, connecting with them. And then we start moving on, and Bob raises his hand. But in my situation, and I say, hang on, Bob, we stopped and we gave you the best feedback we had about how these can be used. Please refer to that. Take a look there first before we go into taking more time to talk about this, right? Sometimes I may talk to Bob after class and say, hey, is this really the right environment for you? Do you feel like you might need a higher level of care? And maybe you need to consider family therapy or a mediator or this or that as something as a higher level of care. And that can be really important. There's also a difficult balance or a delicate balance of mixing in lectures and activities, being able to process those activities. What did you learn? What's one thing that you took? What did your group come up with? Again, we want to help them to be able to engage a variety. We want to have them hearing things. We want to have them seeing things. We want to have them doing things. All the different types of learning that are out there, we want to integrate. It can't just be me as a talking head, just standing up here talking the whole time. We have to have them do it. It's why there are so many assignments in this class to get you out there. We talked about last time, tell, show, and do. Telling is the least effective. It's where I just hand you the material. Seeing is where we bump it up, where you're doing some demonstrations, some role plays, some coaching. Doing is where we get to small group interactions, skill practice, or those other things. I want to spend a lot of time with do. I have to do some tell to educate. Then I have to maybe show them to demonstrate, but then they have to do it because ultimately it's them that are having the conversation, not me. So I want to make sure it's in that place. Maybe the biggest thing that we miss sometimes, we talk about something, but we don't actually do it. Skill practice is one of the most important things. It doesn't matter if they can talk about it. If they can't do it, it doesn't help them. So we have to make it concrete. We have to give them acronyms or other structures. We have to make it safe, and we have to be cautious. If I am teaching them about communication and disagreements, I don't say, hey, pick a conflict in your marriage. I had someone do that once who was presenting with me, and the couple in the class chose their sex life or their lack of a sex life. And that's what they were discussing in the middle of a group. And it led to this huge, loud fight that ultimately that person had to take them out into the hall. We had to go and get a therapist to help calm them down and to work through things. Why? Because we offered them pick a problem. Instead, we say something like, for speaking and listening, let's say you wanted to go somewhere for dinner. You want to go to a Mexican restaurant that's loud and fun, and there's a lot of energy, and the food is really good, and you want to have that opportunity to celebrate. And you would like something that's quiet and intimate, and maybe it's a romantic Italian restaurant, and it'll allow you to be just the two of you in a little alcove. Talk about the differences in what you're expecting and what you want. A, they're both going on a date. B, they're both spending time together and getting something to eat. So it's a win-win in that form or fashion. We just disagree where. It's not the biggest problem that they have, but they don't need the biggest problem. They just need to practice the skills. While they're doing that, I want to make sure I'm popping around to the groups to make sure they're doing it right, or to make sure it's not getting out of hand, or to redirect. Sometimes in groups, the group doesn't do anything. I want to come by and hold them accountable to make them do something. So it's important for me to use that and to be able to do that. And one of the techniques we used before was this speaker listener technique. And we had them actually kind of go through and implement the rules. That's an example of skill practice that you could use. You also want to integrate learning and talk about, since we met last, what have you been doing differently? What does that look like? How has it worked? I can't tell you the number of times someone's talking about something successfully that they did, and I see a spouse elbow another spouse, we should have done that. We could have tried that. Like, that's what we need, sort of thing. And so the group is teaching each other. So we need to look for opportunities to do that, because that's going to reinforce the learning that we have. Okay. So there are a variety of techniques that we'll learn, and we'll get into some of those a little bit more. But we have to think about role plays as a show activity, group activities, sculptures, family sculpting. We haven't talked about that very much, but I'll explain it here. Sculpting is where we use time or space to represent things. For example, one of the best sculpting activities you can do is to turn the room into a continuum. And so you recognize that the room represents a continuum. And over here, these were the parents who were super strict and made their kids follow every rule. And there was a time you got up, there's something you did, you had jobs, like everything was set. Over here, these were the parents where there were no rules. And it's just, eat when you want to, and maybe get up and maybe go to school, and you choose, sort of thing. And you ask the group to stand up and to go to that place along the continuum and stand, the type of parents you had. And maybe my parents were strict, so I stood over here. And maybe another person stands, over here, and they say, like, my parents barely even knew I was there. Like, I'm way on the fringe. And as they're doing that, you as an educator can go around, and what was it like to have strict parents? What was good about it? What was so challenging about it? Over here on this end, what was good about not having parents tell you to do everything? What was bad about it? Did you feel cared for? As you do something like that, people are learning by actually moving somewhere, right? We can also have someone say, well, what would it look like how's it different with a step family? And you say, well, let's look at it. Who's involved? Well, there's a mom. Come here, mom. Dad, come here. This is what it looks like. Okay, here's the X. You're represented here. Are you supporting this family, or are you pulling? Well, they're pulling. Okay. So what do? We use people to represent situations, space, other things to keep them involved. So sculpting is a way of getting people actively involved and moving to create perspective. And what's really interesting is when you see it, there is a visceral response. You're like, yep, that's it. That's the problem that I have. And when you help to resolve it, it helps someone recognize what's going on here. And it's a great way to teach. And so we're going to get you involved in creating role plays, creating sculptures, creating group activities, so that you have some of these things in your lessons that are going to be more effective. Some of the show and do levels, so it's not just an information dump. Okay. You'll want to pick things that match your learning outcomes, that will help you to accomplish those learning outcomes. And we're going to keep operating on that principle. So you're going to start to get into some of these early assignments that are going to provide you information and help you to design ultimately the lesson that you need to deliver to the audience you have. So I hope you've taken something from lecture today and see something that you can apply and put it into good work, to good use. So go ahead and get busy, and good luck with the assignments.